The wind off the Pacific never really stopped moving on San Clemente Island. It didn't just blow, it hunted for weaknesses. It came in sideways off the ocean, slid across the range in long, uneven breaths, bent the mirage above the deck just enough to make any lazy assumption expensive. Flags along the firing line snapped, then sagged, then snapped again. At 600 yards, the mirage leaned right. At 800, it danced left. The steel target sat even farther than that, tucked back near a rocky outcrop at an awkward angle, partially screened by a rise in the terrain. It was positioned by people who knew exactly what they were doing, people who wanted to punish anyone who trusted a single wind call for more than a heartbeat. This wasn't a casual shoot. No, hey, let's burn some ammo before lunch. It was a joint precision marksmanship evaluation, part demonstration, part certification. On the firing line, shooters in mixed uniforms. Behind them, program managers in polo shirts and ball caps. Instructors with arms crossed. A couple of quiet men in plain clothes whose opinions would never show up on any roster but would decide budgets, equipment, doctrine. The shot had been designed to be hard, borderline unreasonable. A test meant to separate real consistency from reputation. 11 shooters had already taken their turns. They were known names in their corners of the community. Army, Marines, Navy. A couple of special operations attachments. Men who talked easily about schools attended, deployments survived, units joined. Their stories had a certain rhythm. Back in '09 in Helmand, when I was in Ramadi, at Bragg we used to. They joked loudly while setting up, bumped shoulders, slapped each other on the back. They complained about the wind like it was a personal insult someone had ordered just to spite them. When the first shooter missed, there were chuckles. It was early. Fine. Nobody hits everything. When the third missed, the jokes got sharper, turned outward. By the seventh, excuses started stacking like empty brass at their knees. Optics tracking off. That gust came out of nowhere. Target angles jacked. Spotter was late. Each shot broke with confidence. Each impact landed in the dirt with the same dull puff. Each miss landed with a heavier, more unsatisfying silence. No ring, no sway, just that steel silhouette out there, still, unimpressed, as if it were watching them instead of the other way around. Off to the side of all that noise, just outside the loose semicircle of shooters and evaluators, a woman stood with a clipboard tucked under her arm. She wore plain Navy utilities, desert-tanned boots, trousers bloused correctly, blouse sleeves rolled to regulation. No shiny rank to catch the eye. Her name tape was there if you bothered to look, but no one had. Her hair was pulled back tight and practical. Nothing fancy, nothing that would make you do a double take. On the roster, her role was simple logistics support. Data cards, timekeeping, making sure the right rifle ended up with the right shooter, the right ammunition count got logged, the right forms got signed. A helper, a support buddy. She didn't comment when shots broke, didn't flinch when they missed. She watched the flags, the grass, the shimmer above the deck. She watched the interval between gusts, the way the mirage leaned and then straightened. Every few seconds, she glanced down and wrote something small and precise in tight, clean handwriting. Someone had noticed her earlier, briefly. Hey, one of the civilian techs had held out a laminated chart. Can you track shot numbers for Station 3 as well? She just nodded. Yes, sir. That was all they'd heard from her since 0700. After the ninth miss, the energy shifted. The easy laughter curdled into embarrassment. Frustration started leaking out sideways, looking for a target that wasn't the mirror. One of the shooters, a tall Army staff sergeant who'd been particularly loud all morning, rolled off the rifle with a curse, shook his head, and forced a laugh that sounded a little too hard. "This thing's cursed," he said, patting the stock like it had betrayed him. There were a few nervous chuckles, a couple of shrugs. People shifted their weight, looking anywhere but at the dirt splash on the berm. The staff sergeant's eyes wandered, searching for somewhere else to put the attention. They landed on the edge of the group. On her. She was writing again, head tilted slightly as she watched the wind flag halfway downrange. He smirked. Hey, he raised his voice just enough for the nearby group to hear. Why don't we let her try? Heads turned. A couple of people snorted. Someone else gave that smirk people share when they think they are in on the joke but not responsible for it. It wasn't an invitation. It was a setup, a way to turn their collective failure into entertainment, to push the pressure off themselves and onto someone it wouldn't matter to. A support girl. An easy punchline. She heard him. Of course she did. The woman looked up from the clipboard, met his eyes briefly. There was no irritation in her face. No embarrassed smile. No flinch. Just acknowledgement. A simple, level look that said, "I heard you. I understand exactly what you meant." She let the silence hang for a beat. Then she stepped forward. The laughter thinned as she crossed the gravel, boots crunching softly on the compacted dirt. The sound cut through the mutters and small talk more than any shouted command would have. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. Up close, there was nothing theatrical about her. No swaggering walk. No exaggerated confidence. No attempt at false modesty either. She moved like someone who was more familiar with carrying weight than being the center of attention. She stopped near the firing point, set her clipboard down carefully, parallel to the edge of the shooting mat, and looked at the rifle lying there. For a moment nobody said anything. The staff sergeant who'd volunteered her stood half smiling, expecting her to balk, to laugh it off, to step back and prove the joke harmless. She didn't. She didn't touch the rifle. She didn't even kneel. Instead, without raising her voice, she asked a single question, calm and clear, pitched to carry just enough. "What wind call are you using for the last two-thirds of flight?" No sarcasm. No bite. Just professional curiosity. The words landed harder than any missed shot. No one answered right away. The staff sergeant blinked, opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced toward his spotter, who looked suddenly like he wanted to be anywhere else. We've been holding," the spotter started, then trailed off, eyes drifting back toward the range like the numbers might be hovering in the air out there if he stared hard enough. A few heads turned toward the flags, as if they might offer a quick cheat sheet. Others looked at each other, silently asking, "You tracking a different call for bullet flight time? Are you?" The wind shifted again, just slightly. A small flag halfway out dipped, then snapped back. Mirage bent a different way. She watched it. That shift alone answered her question and confirmed what she already knew. For the first time all morning, the range went quiet. Not the good quiet of focus before a shot. The heavy quiet of people realizing they might not be the most qualified person in the room, and that the one who had just stepped into the light they tried to push her out of. She didn't push the moment. She didn't fill the silence. She just waited, still and composed, as their own doubt did the work for her. To most of the people on that range, she was background. She'd arrived early, before the first shooters, wearing the same uniform as the rest of the Navy support staff. She'd unloaded gear cases, checked target cameras with the techs, laid out pins and laminated cards. She'd answered questions with "yes, sir," and "copy," and had never once introduced herself with anything more than her last name. In this world, that was enough for people to put her in a box, administration support. The one you sent for coffee when things ran long. That was by design. Her reassignment paperwork had been smooth, almost suspiciously so. Clean language about recovery and temporary duty. A line about leveraging operational experience in a training environment. No mention of the night everything went sideways. No mention of the helicopter banking hard with one engine failing, of the dull, shocking impact when she hit the bulkhead, of the way her leg hadn't answered the way it had every day of her life before that. They had been aboard. There were always boards. Doctors. Officers. People who looked more at metrics than at the kind of knowledge that didn't fit into a checkbox. They hadn't said, "We're done with you." They'd said, "We're just going to move you for now. Let things settle. This is temporary." Temporary had a way of stretching. She hadn't argued. Not because she agreed, but because she understood the cost of making yourself a problem. She'd seen what happened to guys who fought every line on every paper. Sometimes they won. More often, they got sidelined harder. She carried herself now like someone who understood consequences, not in the abstract, but carved into bone and career. She kept her gear plain. No unofficial patches, nothing that invited a "hey, what's that from?" conversation. Her watch was basic. Her boots were scuffed but cared for. There was a small scar at the edge of her hairline that only showed if the light hit just right, and another one on her left-hand knuckle from somewhere a long way from California. Her habits, though, betrayed a different background. She read Mirage the way other people read clocks. She didn't stare at the target when others were shooting. She watched the air in front of it, checked the lay of grass halfway down, noted the lag between gusts, the cycle pattern only someone used to living with wind would notice. When a shooter settled behind the rifle, she'd glance at their body position. Was their spine relaxed or twisted? Were their toes dug in like they were bracing for recoil instead of letting the stock do the work? Did their trigger finger move as an independent piece, or did the whole hand clench when they fired? She checked rifle cant almost without thinking about it, eyes flicking to see if the horizontal line of the scope matched the horizon before the shot broke. That little detail alone had taken her weeks of repetition to ingrain years ago, and now it was just part of what she saw when she looked at a shooter. She watched like a coach, like an instructor, like someone who'd been responsible for other people's shots, not just her own. She had learned early in her career that talking got people killed, not conversation itself. There was always time for morale, for jokes, for taking the edge off. But talking about the wrong things. Making yourself larger than the mission. Letting your story be the loudest thing in the room. She'd watched a teammate once brag his way into a slot he wasn't quite ready for. Watched him freeze when the plans started to unravel. Watched others pick up the slack mid-contact while he tried to remember exactly which war story he was supposed to be living up to. After that, she stopped volunteering much of anything. There were things she never talked about now. Nights on maritime interdiction patrols in the Gulf. Black water slapping the hull of a rigid hull inflatable as it cut silently toward a suspect dhow. Boarding ladders clanking softly against metal. Night vision green in her eyes. The controlled chaos of a compliant boarding that could turn non-compliant in the space of one bad translation. There was the rooftop in Mosul, flat and broken and hot even at night, where she'd laid in the dark with a rifle pressed into a firing position that made everything numb from hip to ankle. Below, a partnered unit moved through narrow streets, their radio traffic a mix of English and Arabic, their lives balanced on her ability to see what they couldn't. There was the evacuation that went wrong. The one with the helicopter and the engine and the sudden, sickening tilt. The one that had put a hairline fracture where no one would ever see it, in bone and in trust. Those memories stayed compartmentalized, filed away in a system she didn't show anyone. Not out of drama, but out of habit. Compartmentalization kept things clean. It let you function. It kept you from expecting anyone who hadn't been there to understand. On the range, watching men with impressive resumes miss the same shot over and over, she didn't feel smugness. She just felt a familiar, quiet frustration. Not at them, not personally. She knew how easy it was to get wrapped up in your own track record, but at the culture that rewarded volume over observation. At the way people with microphones and confidence got listened to long before the ones paying attention in the background. When she'd asked her question about the wind call, she hadn't meant to embarrass anyone. She hadn't even intended to step into the center of anything. It was reflex. See problem, offer correction. That was how her brain was wired after years of being told that complacency kills. She stood there now, hands relaxed at her sides, while the group subtly resorted their mental filing of who she was. Support staff, logistics, or something else. She didn't rush them. Quiet professionals learn early that people don't change their minds because you tell them to. They change their minds when the evidence becomes too heavy to ignore. The answer, when it finally came, sounded like it had been assembled on the fly. We've been, holding about $1.5 million for full value, the spotter said. All the way. He spoke like that should have closed the subject. $1.5 million. Full value wind. Good enough. She tilted her head, eyes still on the range. All the way, she asked. Muzzle to target. The staff sergeant shifted his weight. Yeah, that's the call. There was a hint of defensiveness in it now. Not outright hostility, just the kind of tone people used when they felt they were being challenged in front of an audience. She nodded once. File that away. A static call in a dynamic wind. Fine for mid-range, in forgiving conditions. This was neither. The senior evaluator checked his tablet, then his watch. He wore a collared shirt with a logo stitched over the chest and sunglasses that cost more than some private's monthly pay. His background wasn't nothing. He'd shot at a high level once, years ago, but his real skill now was reading rooms, not wind. He cleared his throat. Time is a factor, folks, he called out. We need to keep this moving. The rotation continued. The 10th shooter set up, took his time, checked his dope, asked his spotter for the same call everyone else was using, and sent a round that smacked into dirt short and left, exactly where physics dictated it would. The 11th walked up with shoulders stiff, aware that if he missed, the pattern stopped being an individual problem and turned into a system failure. He wanted to break it and, in wanting it too badly, rushed the sequence. His shot went high, wind still unaccounted for in the last 200 yards of flight. Miss. Excuses grew sharper, voices louder. The staff sergeant kicked at the gravel near the mat with the edge of his boot, as if the surface itself were to blame. Another shooter muttered just loud enough to be heard. Who the hell designs a test like this? Some engineer who's never been outside a lab. The senior evaluator flinched slightly at that. His eyes darted toward the line of civilian contractors in the back. Bull caps, ear protection, clipboards, relationships, funding, all listening. We may need to pause this, the evaluator said carefully to the group closest to him. He didn't project this time. He didn't want it on the record. Conditions are less than ideal. The implication hung in the air like cordite. Better to stop than to fail in front of witnesses. Better to blame the wind, the setup, the equipment, anything but the possibility that they weren't reading the problem right. She took half a step forward, breath drawn to speak. It was a simple fix in her head. Adjust the wind strategy, change the cadence, pick one shooter and one spotter who could actually communicate. This was solvable. We've got this. One of the shooters cut in, turning slightly toward her, palm raised in a small, dismissive gesture. His voice wasn't harsh, but it was final. Thanks. Support's good. We'll handle the shooting. There was an assumption in that wave that she'd seen 100 times. You're here to help, not to lead. You manage the pens. We'll manage the bullets. So she stepped aside. She moved back to her small folding table, picked up her pen, and rewrote a couple of numbers she'd been tracking. Gust intervals. Mirage lean. The way the flags halfway downrange didn't match the ones near the firing line. She was halfway through rewriting a line of notation when a shoulder brushed her arm. Not hard. Not violent, just enough to jostle her clipboard. The tip of her pen streaked across the paper, smearing one column of digits into an unreadable line. Her thumb caught the edge of the board to keep it from tumbling to the ground. Oh, sorry, the staff sergeant said. He didn't sound sorry. She looked down at the smeared ink, then up at him. His mouth held a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. If she's so smart, he said lightly, loud enough for the others in his cluster to hear, let her shoot. This time the laughter that followed wasn't full-throated. It was thin, brittle around the edges. A couple of guys gave each other sideways glances like, this is getting weird, but no one voiced it. They'd reached that point in a group dynamic where everyone could feel something was off, but no one wanted to be the one to call it out. The disrespect wasn't just personal. It never was, in institutions like this. It was procedural. It was the same tone that cut off junior NCOs in briefings. The same habit that dismissed good intel because it came from a source without a big enough title. The same reflex that decided who got heard in meetings, who got written off as emotional, who carried the blame when things went wrong because they weren't important enough for anyone to defend. She rewrote her notes from memory. Calm, precise, numbers and short, coded remarks. She trained herself to be able to reconstruct entire conditioned strings after a firefight. A little smeared ink on a comm range was nothing. The frustration in the air thickened. Not hers. Theirs. The wind picked up, then dropped. Two flags showed different values at the same moment, and no one on the line seemed to register the meaning. Light shifted as high clouds slid across the sun, changing the way the target contrasted against the backdrop. Mirage flattened, then came back. The range safety officer checked his own watch and stepped closer to the evaluator. Sir, "We're bumping up on the window," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "We push much further, and we're not going to meet the safety margin on the back end." Translation: your timetable and range control's timetable were about to collide, and range control always won. The evaluator's jaw tightened. He wasn't just thinking about the shooters now. He was thinking about what he would have to type into his after-action notes, about the conference call where this event would be discussed, about the line where he'd have to explain why an expensive test event ended with conditions did not permit completion. This wasn't a joke anymore. It wasn't even primarily about marksmanship. It was about process, credibility. Whether this whole showcase would be another example of a system that preferred stories over performance. She watched him absorb the pressure, watched him look left and right for an easy out. And for the second time that morning, she stepped into a space no one had invited her into, because the alternative was letting bad habits win again. The senior evaluator moved a few steps away from the firing line, enough to talk without competing with the sound of ear-pro and range commands. The Marine Scout Sniper instructor followed, hands in his pockets, ball cap pulled low. He'd been quiet most of the morning, saying little, watching everything. From her station, she could see their body language if not hear every word. The evaluator's hands moved in small chopping motions. The Marine mostly just nodded, then shook his head once, firmly. She didn't need to hear the conversation to know the shape of it. She'd seen similar ones in different uniforms and different countries. "This isn't about pride," the Marine said finally, his voice low but carrying enough that a few nearby caught it. "Your process is broken." The evaluator bristled a little at that, shoulders squaring almost reflexively. He wasn't used to being told that in front of anyone. "Broken," he repeated. "We've got some of the best. And they're all doing the same wrong thing." The Marine cut in. "No heat, just fact. Same static hold. Same rush to beat the gust instead of timing it. Same spotter language that tells the shooter nothing useful until after the impact. That's not a win problem. That's a procedure problem." The evaluator fell quiet. The Marine glanced downrange. "Right now you have a test that punishes bad habits. That's good. That's what it's supposed to do. But if you pause this and blame conditions, you're telling everyone watching that you don't understand the habits it's exposing." He let that hang. The evaluator swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing. He knew what a formal failure here meant. He could already see the slide deck, joint precision evaluation, outcome, inconclusive. He could hear the questions. Why didn't your shooters perform? Were the test conditions unrealistic? Or is the pipeline producing people who can't adapt? Either way, someone was going to pay for it. And it was never the ones at the very top. The Marine's tone softened just a fraction. "You fix this now. You walk out of here with a stronger protocol instead of a weaker excuse." Behind them, another small knot of shooters was arguing quietly about whether the rifles had been properly zeroed at that specific distance. Someone else suggested swapping optics. Anything but address the wind calls. The woman, quiet, forgettable logistics support, could hear enough, see enough, to know the moment was sliding toward yet another institutional shrug. She felt a familiar weight settle in her chest. The one that came before she spoke up in rooms where she wasn't expected to. The part of her that calculated consequences, career and otherwise. The other part that tallied what it would cost to stay silent. She stepped forward. Not timidly, not aggressively, just directly, like she'd done it 100 times with teammates who actually wanted the truth. "I can walk you through it," she said. Both men turned. She didn't fidget under their gaze. Her hands stayed loose by her sides. Her shoulders remained level. "I can walk you through it," she repeated. "One shooter, one spotter. Adjust cadence. Hold for the mid-flight drift instead of trying to outrun it. We use the flags and mirage as timing, not just decoration." The evaluator's eyebrows went up slightly. He hadn't expected input from that direction. The Marine looked at her more closely now. He wasn't searching her face. He was scanning her gear, her stance, the way she carried herself. There were small tells only people from a certain world recognized. How much weight she kept on the balls of her feet, how her eyes kept cutting to the same 3 reference points downrange, the way she didn't fill her statement with qualifiers. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't asking permission to maybe, possibly contribute. She was offering a solution like someone who'd done this before under conditions that didn't allow for failure. "And what's your background?" the evaluator asked, defaulting to bureaucracy. "Process. Credentials." She looked at him for a beat. "Navy," she said. "Previously operational. Currently assigned to training support." It was technically true. It told him almost nothing. The evaluator's gaze slid to the Marine, silently asking, "Is this for real, or am I about to let a clerk embarrass us further?" The Marine studied her another moment, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Let her shoot," he said. The evaluator hesitated. There was still risk. If she missed, it would be one more data point of failure. But the alternative was limping off the range under the banner of conditions while a line of people who understood better watched him do it. He exhaled. "All right," he said. "One run." Word moved down the line faster than any official announcement. "They're letting support shoot." "You serious?" After all that? No one laughed this time. If anything, a low unease settled over the group. The staff sergeant who'd used her as a punchline just minutes before went a little pale under his tan, realizing his throwaway joke had somehow turned into a real test with real witnesses. She walked back to the firing point, unhurried, as if she'd just been told to inventory another crate. But inside, muscles she'd trained to stay calm under fire slid into familiar positions. Her breathing slowed. The wind noise faded into pattern. The Marine followed a few paces behind, not close enough to loom, just close enough that people saw who was backing this. No one offered to help her with the rifle. No one needed to. She settled beside it, movements compact and efficient, as if she'd done this exact approach 1,000 times before. Because she had, under different skies, with different stakes. "Which gun's been used the most?" she asked quietly. "Number 2, the range tech said. "Barrel's warm, though." "Good. I don't want a cold bore variable." She said it without thinking, and a couple of heads turned again. That was not something most logistic support talked about. She lowered herself to the mat, knees and elbows finding pressure points automatically. The world narrowed down to the rectangle in front of her, the length of the rifle, the space between her focus and the target. "Who's your best spotter?" she asked, not looking up. There was a short, awkward pause. Ego didn't like that question. The Marine answered for them. "Corporal Reyes." A lean Marine with a calm face stepped forward, grabbed his glass, and moved to her left. He'd been quiet most of the day, taking his turn without commentary, logging his own observations. He didn't seem surprised that he'd been picked. He said. She glanced at him, saw steady eyes, no visible need to show off. "Good. I'm not," she said. "Just call it like you see it." She re-shouldered the rifle, set her cheek weld, and settled the buttstock into the pocket of her shoulder. Her hand wrapped around the grip, fingers resting, not choking. Trigger finger lay along the receiver, nowhere near the blade yet. The evaluator watched, arms folded. The staff sergeant hovered just behind the group, hands on hips, jaw tight. The range went oddly still, in that way rangers do when everyone's suddenly aware they might have misread the room. She didn't rush. She let her body sink into the mat, toes flat, legs relaxed but engaged. She built her position from the ground up, the way she'd been taught years ago by an instructor who'd thrown out every movie cliché and started with, "The rifle should barely know you're there." Her breathing smoothed into a slow, controlled cycle. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She watched the reticle bounce gently with each inhale, settle with each exhale. She checked natural point of aim, then checked it again. The crosshairs rested just low and left of the steel target without muscle input. Good. She'd rather move onto the target than fight to keep it centered. "Reyes," she said, eyes still on the glass. "We're going to change how you talk to me." "Yes, Ma." He stopped himself. "Yes. You're going to give me wind at mid-range and near target. Separate. Short words. 0.2 right, 0.5 left. No life story. No pep talk. Just numbers. Copy. And we're not going to chase gusts. We're going to time them. I'll break on the back side of the cycle." Reyes gave a quick nod, even though she couldn't see it. Mirage halfway is running about .8 left right now, he said, slipping into the new rhythm. Knee target, more like .4. Flag show Gus bumping over that. But that's the average. She liked the way he said it. No drama. No, I think. He delivered data. She could work with that. Impact point is what? 850, she asked. 873, the range text supplied. She adjusted elevation on the turret with practiced fingers, counting clicks more by feel than sight. Dial vs hold was always a question of distance, time, and how much cognitive bandwidth you could afford. At this range, with this wind, she dialed for elevation and held for wind. Less to forget under pressure. Left hand under the butt, squeezing the rear bag ever so slightly. She took in the scope sight picture. The target was small but clear, a flat, gray shape against a scrubby, inconsistent backdrop. No sharp landmarks, nothing to cheat off of. Whoever designed this course had been merciless. Good. She listened to the wind. Not the sound itself, but the pattern, the way it rose and fell, the gaps between gusts. She'd done this on ships at sea, on roofs in broken cities, on hillsides where the only cover was how well you understood the air. Mirage halfway leaning harder left now. 1.1, Ray is called. Knee target .6 left. Flags at mid are giving us a short lull every 8 seconds. She counted silently with him, watching the Mirage bend, then relax. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The 8th second, the flag eased, Mirage flattened just a hair, then started to lean again. There it is. She scanned for the next cycle. Needed at least 2 consistent intervals to trust it. Same pattern. 7, 8 seconds between peaks. All right, she murmured, mostly to herself. We'll ride the backside. Behind her, someone shifted. She could feel eyes on her back, on the patch of Velcro near her shoulder that had nothing on it now but the faint, ghosted outline of something removed long ago. The fabric had worn differently there, just enough that someone who knew what to look for could see it. She heard the staff sergeant exhale, a half-scoff, half-laugh, the last remnants of his earlier bravado trying to hang on. If she missed, he'd have a story that would save his ego. If she hit, he'd have to live with the fact that he'd turned himself into background noise in his own story. Range is hot, the safety officer called. Shooter, you may engage when ready. Her world narrowed further. Reticle. Target. Wind. Breath. Mid-mirage 1.0 left, Reyes murmured. Knee target .5 left. Gust building now. 3 seconds to peak. She watched the flag reach, then hesitate at the top. 2 seconds past peak, he said softly. Wind easing, now. On the easing phase, the average would be slightly less than the full value gust number. She settled her hold just shy of the full correction. 0.8 for most of flight, she said. 0.4 last couple hundred. She split the difference, held 0.6 left on the reticle. Her finger found the trigger, pat on the blade, no extra tension. She breathed out, felt her chest settle into the mat, the rifle becoming an extension of bone and intent rather than something sitting on top of her support hand. She rode the exhale down. When it paused, she let the reticle float just a hair, then whispered to herself, break. The shot surprised her, just a little, the way it was supposed to. No jerk, no sudden clamp, just pressure turning into motion. The rifle recoiled into her shoulder, then settled. Dust puffed near the muzzle, then drifted away. The sound rolled downrange, slower than the bullet, a muted echo chasing something already far ahead. The delay stretched. At that distance, you had time to doubt. Time for all the quiet parts of your mind to speak up. Maybe you misread the last gust. Maybe the mirage lied. Maybe the barrel finally walked. She felt each of those old companions brush against her thoughts and let them pass, the way she'd learned to do under far less forgiving circumstances. Then, faint at first, the sound came back. A sharp, clear ring of steel, cutting through wind and distance and ego. The target trembled, swung a fraction of an inch, then steadied. No dust plume in the date. No ambiguous splash. Just the Unmistakable confirmation that metal had met metal exactly where it was supposed to. Silence followed. Not the silence that comes after a near miss, when everyone's scrambling to be the first to offer an excuse. This was the silence of recalculation, of men who'd just watched their entire morning's worth of explanations evaporate in one small, controlled trigger press. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Reyes stayed in his glass. Impact, he said, voice very calm. Dead center, a little low. Call it perfect. She eased her finger off the trigger, took one slow breath, then another. She didn't pump a fist, didn't roll off the rifle like she'd just won a competition. She stayed in position for a moment, observing the conditions, confirming that what she'd read hadn't changed. Then she slowly lifted her head, broke her cheek weld, and looked up. The evaluator stared at her like he'd never seen her before, which, in a way, he hadn't. The Marine's expression didn't change much. Maybe the corner of his mouth ticked up, maybe it didn't. But his eyes were different, focused, respectful in a way that had nothing to do with rank. Behind them, the staff sergeant who'd joked about letting her try looked smaller. Not because anyone had humiliated him out loud, but because he'd just become the guy whose loud confidence had set up a quiet correction he'd never be able to erase from memory. One of the senior observers, a man in a plain ball cap and nondescript jacket, stepped closer. He had the posture of someone who'd carried rucks in other lives, before his job became watching rather than doing. His eyes dropped to the upper left of her blouse, to that faint, worn ghost on the fabric where a patch used to live. At this distance, up close, the outline was clearer, an old squadron or task force emblem, removed in accordance with some regulation or other, but not before the sun and salt and time had etched its absence into the cloth. Then his gaze slid lower, to a small piece of Velcro near her chest where, tucked almost out of sight beneath a pen loop, there was a subdued, unofficial patch barely bigger than a postage stamp. Faded, dark, the kind of thing that only meant something to the handful of people who'd been there when it was earned. He blinked once. Recognition, the kind that reached deeper than an MOS code. That patch, he said quietly. Where did you get that? His voice wasn't accusing. It was cautious, like someone handling something unexpectedly important. She glanced down at it, then back up at him. There were a dozen long answers she could give. Places, dates, names that didn't belong on a range day. Task force rotation, she said simply. Golf. Years ago. It was technically vague and completely specific to anyone who knew what that implied. The man in the ball cap studied her for another half-second, then nodded once, more to himself than to her. Yeah, he said softly. I thought so. Understanding passed between them without spectacle. A quiet handshake neither of them needed to physically make. He turned to the evaluator. You might want to listen to her on process, he said. She's done this when it mattered. There it was. No rank pulled. No medals listed. No dramatic reveal shouted to the assembled crowd. Just a subtle shift in whose word carried weight. The bullies didn't just lose face in that moment. They were exposed. Their reputations had been built on volume, on old stories told well. Hers had been built on results no one in this crowd had bothered to ask about. Until the steel rang. The range didn't turn into a movie after that. There was no slow clap, no sudden line of people rushing to shake her hand. Real places don't work that way. The evaluator cleared his throat, trying to pull his voice back into official mode. All right, he said, louder now. We're going to reset the sequence. Incorporate some adjustments. He glanced at her. Would you mind outlining your approach? For the group. It wasn't an order. It was as close to an apology as someone in his position was going to get in public. She nodded once. We change one thing at a time, she said. You pick one shooter and one spotter for the next run, standardize your wind calls, and stop treating Gus like a surprise. You already know they're coming. Use the cycle. Then we see if that fixes the pattern before we blame the equipment. Her tone was matter-of-fact. Not gloating, not deferential. Just professional. The Marine backed her up with a few tease comments of his own. Between them, they turned what had been a slow-motion embarrassment into an impromptu clinic. Shooters listened now in a way they hadn't before, not because someone yelled at them, but because the evidence of what worked was still ringing in their ears. When the next shooter stepped up under the adjusted protocol, he hit, not as cleanly as she had, but a solid impact. The one after him clipped the edge of the steel, close enough that the correction was obvious. The mood on the line shifted from defensive to focused. No one mentioned her role title again. No one asked her to go back to just logging shots. They didn't suddenly treat her like royalty, either. The military rarely does that for anyone who isn't wearing a star. But small things changed. People moved out of her way instead of around her like she wasn't there. One of the shooters who'd laughed earlier walked past, eyes down, and gave her a small, respectful nod he probably didn't even realize was an apology. The staff sergeant hovered for a long time, clearly wrestling with something. He finally approached as the range started to shut down, rifles going back into cases, target cameras being powered off. "Hey," he said. She looked up from her clipboard. He scratched the back of his neck. "I was out of line earlier." Simple. No justification. No but. She let him hang in that space for a second, then gave a short nod. "Yeah," she said. "You were." He took that hit without flinching. You ever teach?" he asked. "I mean formally." "Sometimes," she said, "when someone wants to learn more than they want to talk." He huffed out a quiet, self-directed laugh. "Copy that." He walked away a little smaller, but maybe better for it. She didn't celebrate. She didn't linger on the congratulations that trickled in from the people who mattered. The Marine, the man in the ball cap, a couple of shooters who came up with genuine questions about wind and cadence instead of flattery. She checked the rifle back into the rack, logged the barrel round count, updated her conditions notes for the after-action packet. She stacked her clipboards, tightened the elastic band around them, and slid them into a case. By the time most people drifted toward the vans for exfil, she was already by the tailgate of a pickup, helping a tech strap down Pelican cases. To someone driving past, she looked exactly like what her roster said she was: logistic support. Background. Necessary but unremarkable. That's where quiet professionals live most of their lives, in the spaces nobody pays attention to until something goes wrong. They live in the shadows of loud stories, in the gaps between official narratives, in the memory of a handful of people who were close enough to see the work and smart enough to understand its cost. She didn't need the range to know what she'd done that day. She'd known it the second the steel rang, and the silence that followed told her exactly whose illusions had just cracked. As the last van door slid shut, she took one last look at the flags downrange. Wind still shifting, mirage still bending. Same conditions, different understanding. Later, when the story got told, because stories like this always do get told, it would grow and shrink depending on who was talking. Some would turn it into a joke about getting shown up by the support girl. Others would use it as a lesson on why you listen before you laugh. Somewhere, on a couch or at a kitchen table, a veteran watching the story would recognize the pattern long before the reveal. The quiet one in the corner, the one with the plain gear and the careful eyes, the one nobody took seriously until there was nothing left between them and failure. And maybe the script would end with a simple question to the audience. Who was your quiet legend? The one nobody believed until it mattered. Because in every unit, in every deployment, in every forgotten range on some wind-burned island, there's someone like her, standing off to the side, logging details no one asked for, waiting patiently for the moment when the noise burns out and there's finally room for competence to speak.